Hello, a very warm good morning to all of you and welcome to Unacademy. Welcome to today's The Hindu newspaper analysis, where we take a look at the Delhi edition of today's The Hindu newspaper, analyze and bring forward for your analysis important articles relevant for your prelims as well as the mains examination. Wherever possible, we shall be delving into the details and wherever required into the areas which are even not mentioned in the article, but something which you should know for your preparation of the examination. While carrying out the discussion of the articles, we shall also be discussing the subjective type questions and how to write the answer for that. And at the end of the discussion, I urge and request all of you to do visit the Telegram page and take up the quiz and the questions, the multiple choice questions which can be framed from this particular topics in order to gauge an idea about your overall assessment and the understanding that you have gained for all these articles. Now, before we take a look at the topics that we are going to discuss for today, a brief and a minor announcement for all of you. Now, while you are preparing for the examination, mains examination ends up being one of the significant hurdles. Now, difference creator in the mains examination is created by your choice of optionals and how you have prepared for your optionals. Keeping that in mind, we at Unacademy have brought for you a plethora of various different optional subjects to choose from the top educators across the country for various different optional subjects. For the first time in English medium, geography and history as an optional has also been launched on the platform. So do attend these optional batches, and whichever educator, whichever particular optional that you like, do follow those particular optionals and get enrolled thereby. Use the code and thereby avail the maximum discount as possible. Now, after that, we take a look at the topics that we are going to discuss for today. So today in total we are going to have a discussion for 8 different topics from various different areas, from GS paper 1 to GS paper 3. So a silent democratic backlash in South Asia. Now, this is an editorial piece largely talking about the comparative analysis of Pakistan, as well as in this particular case the analysis of India and how India has maintained its democratic fabric, whereas in Pakistan that democratic fabric has been distorted, to say the least. So now this is relevant for your GS paper 1 and GS paper 2. Then, war and peace. Now, this is an editorial piece written about India's stance and India's posturing as a mediator between the Russia and Ukraine war, and in order to resolve the crisis, where should India place itself? Again, relevant for your GS paper 2. Sharpening India's anti-tuberculosis fight. This is about the drug-resistant TB, which is very prevalent in our country. So, what is that drug-resistant TB? That is something we are going to analyze. And what are the ways that we can implement in order to get rid of this crisis? This is relevant for your GS paper 3. Then, establishing a carbon market. Now, as India seeks to transition itself into a greener economy, into a kind of a carbon emission neutral economy, thereby what are the various different measures and ways that India can pursue and India can follow? Again, relevant for your GS paper 3. So, as you can see, an overall coverage will be there. Other than that, we shall be talking about some of the articles relevant for your prelims. India-Russia sign a working plan to handle emergencies. The Chandipura virus, the outbreak of it is quite significant. Great Nicobar project, fingers have been pointed and issues have been raised regarding the clearance provided for that Great Nicobar project. We are going to use these articles in order to understand the issue behind it rather than looking at the political aspect. Then CCEA clears 12 industrial parks across 10 states. Now, these are the articles that we are going to discuss, starting with the first article of the day, a silent democratic backlash in South Asia. Now, this article sets its context and its background with the fact that the recent happenings in the region of Pakistan, in the region of Bangladesh, all of them indicate that there is democratic ideals which are staging a comeback in these particular areas. And the article has in fact gone ahead and also argued that the result of Indian elections as per the elections of 2024 also indicate, given the fact that the ruling party has not been able to gather majority on its own. So that also, as per this article, indicates a return of the democratic ideals. Now here, what we can do is, we have to analyze this article bereft of any kind of political or any kind of biases and understand the progress or the development of these democratic ideals in countries like India and in the neighboring region such as Pakistan. Both of us became independent almost at the same time, and both of us have a colonial legacy. And despite all of that, India has been deeply rooted in democratic ideals, whereas in Pakistan, democracy is a far-fetched dream even today. So what has changed and how this has been panning out? So let us declutter the entire thing. So when we talk about the neighboring nation of Pakistan and we compare it to the situation in India. Now, one thing which is common for both of them is the fact that both of these countries have a colonial legacy. That is the only binding fact. Colonial legacy. Now, why is this colonial legacy important? Because our experiences during the time of colonialism, our experiences during the time of the British Raj has largely ended up framing the policy frameworks of these independent nations, but also at the same time has shaped the society's mindset with regards to what is required and what is to be expected out of a government setup. Now, when we talk about a country like Pakistan, now there, immediately after independence, when Pakistan waged its first war against India in 1948, at that point of time itself, there grew a tiff between the civilian leadership and the military leadership. The civilian leadership hesitated to some extent with regards to what should be the role of the army in that war. And army which faced a defeat on the sides of the Indian army when Indian army was deployed in Jammu and Kashmir and Indian army started gaining grounds. Now, the military leadership in Pakistan had to deflect the blame, and the blame started being shifted to the civilian leadership. So, in the very initial days, you had the civilian military discord or tiff. Whereas, in the case of India, you will find, and we all know about the fact, that there has always been a civilian supremacy, be it the defense secretaries at the time of Krishna Menon. Since that point of time itself, the civilian leadership has always gained and has been given that kind of a supremacy. So that civilian supremacy, the article argues, has been very important in rooting the democratic ideals in our country. So here you have the civilian supremacy. Now, civilian supremacy as in that the elected representatives, the government of the day, will end up taking the decisions with regards to India's defenses, with regards to India's interests, rather than the armed forces. That is the aspect of civilian supremacy. It is not the fact that a common individual civilian has got that much power or not. No, it has got to do with the elected representatives of the day. Now, in the case of Pakistan, after almost a couple of decades from that time itself, you had an increased interference of the military leadership, you had military coups which were underway, and in fact the military gained so much amount of power and so much amount of attention that it ended up carrying out significant amount of repression in the East Pakistan, present day Bangladesh. Now, the purpose of the military leadership at that point of time was to curb dissent and to ensure that East Pakistan does not get separated from the rest of Pakistan, but the contrary of that actually happened, where you had the entire country of Pakistan getting broken into Pakistan and Bangladesh. Now, again, whenever these kind of setbacks have been suffered by the military leadership of Pakistan, immediately the blame is shifted to the civilian government. And the public perception at large is developed in such a way that, look, whenever you have the interference by the civilian government, that is when we experience failures. That is when we experience a kind of setback. Now, this also has been attributed in the article to the political establishment that both of these countries inherited after independence. In India, after independence, the political party that was the most dominant political party at that point of time was the Congress party. And the Congress party and the other parties of that time largely constituted, when it comes to the cadres, when it comes to the people, working people. Now, that largely constituted of the kind of middle income people or the middle income population. Whereas in Pakistan, the political system has always been represented by landed autocracy, the landowners, right? The zamindars of that time, who had very large amount of land and who basically were known as the oppressors and the elitist of the elite of the society. So when you have the middle income group population in the political class, or the kind of mid group in the political class, it is always having a greater resonance with the population. The population tends to believe that these people who we have elected, they will represent our interests and they will take care of our interests when they are voted to power. So that automatically instills some amount of trust, some amount of basic belief in the political establishment and in the government. Whereas when you compare it to Pakistan, where the political class was represented by the zamindars and the landed autocrats, now there, immediately when there is any crisis, the confidence shakes with regards to what the political class tries to represent, and that elitism and the common population, the gap between them is too difficult to bridge. So this is another reason why there has been a different route taken by India and Pakistan, that is the political class. Political class in this case were the zamindars and elites, whereas in case of India, they were largely represented by middle income group or the common population, common man. Now, this article also argues that, look, there have been phases even in India's transition or India's journey. For example, at the time where emergency was proclaimed and emergency was declared. Now, that was a democratic backsliding. That was something which basically hammered at the basic ideals of democratic setup and democratic governance. But at that time also, few of the Indian population, few amongst the Indian population, they welcomed the imposition of emergency, because they thought that the system will become much more efficient, effective, corruption free, without any other political interests. Because the political class or the government or the establishment is always seen to be promoting some or the other vested interest. So that is what the article argues, that look, at the time of imposition of emergency, there was that backsliding, and that backsliding could have been very huge had there not been a comeback staged by the other political people and also the larger population, where all the population made their interests very clear that they want an elected government and they want their elected representatives to voice their opinions. Whereas in Pakistan, slowly and steadily, once the military started grabbing the hold of power, after that point of time, the public perception also supported the military with the same ideals, that it will be corruption free, it will be more efficient, effective, without any promotion of vested interests. So that ideal or that thought, that who can provide this particular case of efficient governance, has led to military supremacy in Pakistan, whereas in India, the population's belief largely has been that elected representatives are the best suited ones. Now, it is only apt for us to recall the famous saying or the famous adage which goes that democracy is not the best form of governance, but the other alternatives are much worse, which tells you that of the various different forms and methodologies of governance which are available as models across the world, democratic setup is the best suited one. Now, this is where, in light of the recent events in Pakistan, where even when you talk about the recent elections, these elections, various different political parties, they have started voicing their opinion against the military establishment and the military leadership. And this is something which has been seen as a coming back of democratic ideals. This had started immediately after the armed forces coup, which was initiated by General Musharraf. Now, during the reign of General Musharraf, at that point of time itself, you had the lawyers' movement which gripped the popular imagination in the entire country of Pakistan. Ever since that point of time, various political parties have started pitching their opinion and their voice that how the military leadership is actually distorting Pakistan's interest and taking various different initiatives and actions which are not in Pakistan's interests. Recently, when you take the case in the recent situation of Imran Khan. Now, Imran Khan's main political pitch had always been that the establishment is against them and the establishment is acting to isolate them. Now, this has resonated with the public at large. Now, when you consider these elections, recently held elections in Pakistan, you will observe that Imran Khan and Imran Khan's party was isolated and was not allowed to participate in a wholehearted manner, but still gained the popular traction and popular vote, which tells you that there is a popular public opinion which is siding with the elected representatives against the military establishment. And that is why people's faith in this election in Pakistan has been very low. People believe that this election has been reduced to a sham or a kind of a shambolic exercise where there has not been a democratic outcome. Now, this is seen as a positive sign. Whereas in country like India, there has always been a very good and cherished tradition, which even countries like US cannot boast, that each and every election has been touted to be free and fair. The incumbent and even the government which takes the oath or the government which comes into power or the people who are voted out, never has there been any allegation with regards to tampering of votes or tampering of the entire electoral system. Whereas in Bangladesh we observe that, whereas in Pakistan we observe that, but India has been an island of democratic ideals, to say the least. So these are the respective journeys that they have covered. But then the final point which is touched by this article, which is important for us to know, is the fact that even this resonating of democratic ideals in Pakistan, the protests which are being arranged, the aspect where the elections are being called a sham because it is being supported by the establishment, all of that. And even when we talk about the comparison with Indian electoral process, where the electorate ends up deciding that no, this time the government maybe deserves a majority or does not deserve a majority, all of that is rooted in the aspect of larger public awareness. The younger generation, that is the newer generation, which is rooted in the era of information. Now, the flood of information all around and the aspect of comparative analysis, the advantage that the younger generation has, that today they can always end up comparing that these are the systems prevalent in such and such countries, that is the outcome that we get. These are the systems implemented in such countries, that is the outcome. So that is where they end up making much more informed decision. It is very difficult to repress the voice of the citizenry in this modern era of information and awareness. So, if we have to actually summarize the entire aspect in one single sentence or one single phrase, democratic ideals and ensuring the maintenance of democratic ideals is dependent upon the information age and the awareness of the citizenry. So, awareness of the citizenry is a must. of citizenry. But that also ends up throwing certain challenges along our way. What are the challenges? For example, let's suppose when we talk about the information age, there is also the fear of misinformation. And misinformation is in front of all of us, where you have the case where US has been alleging for a long time, almost a decade now, that Russia has been tampering with its electoral process by providing misinformation. And it has been recorded fact that this misinformation campaign, which starts spreading immediately before or during the election, can end up tampering with the electoral outcomes as well. So that is something we have to be aware of. And in the era of AI driven technology and deep fakes, we have to be very, very clear and very, very, in a way, cautious with regards to what is the information that we consume. So it can happen that democratic roots are something which is a larger goal or idea of the citizenry, but that can be disrupted by this era of misinformation. So while awareness of citizenry is a way to look forward to, but at the same time, we have to be cautious of misinformation. So that is what this article argues, that why democracy has found deep roots in India, whereas in Pakistan it is still on a shaky ground, but then the awareness of the citizenry is making sure that democracy makes a comeback in all the other regions of South Asia in general. Okay? Now, coming to the second article with regards to war and peace. Now, this particular article is talking about India's posturing as a mediator or as a kind of a peace broker in between Russia and Ukraine. As has been highlighted by various different forums across the world, and this is something which has came to much greater prevalence and prominence due to Prime Minister's visit in Russia, followed by the Prime Minister's visit in Ukraine. Now, both these visits, the aim has been that the Indian government tries to broker peace between these two nations, which have been at war with each other for almost 2 years now. Now, the Prime Minister is slated immediately after his visit to Ukraine. The Prime Minister had a conversation with the US President and sharing his ideas and sharing his feedback of the visit. And the Prime Minister is slated to visit the UN next month, and after that again Russia in the month of October for the BRICS summit. So this further puts India into that unique position of few of the countries which actually want to see peace to prevail. But then there are certain issues. So what are the issues? So first of all, India's stance has been what? When we talk about India's stance, and has been reiterated by the Prime Minister again and again, that India stands on the side of peace. Right? So peace should prevail. But the problem or the issues are what? The issue has been that regardless of whatever India says, India is seen to be partial towards the Russian and the Russian establishment, owing to its defense relationships, the equipments that India gets from Russia, as well as the fact that India has significantly imported large amount of Russian oil and thereby helped Russia gain some amount of revenue. The Western world at one point of time had its only agenda to cut all the economic ties that Russia has with any part of the world, and the world expected India to toe that line. But India basically took an independent stance that we cannot allow the inflated oil prices to disrupt our economic system, and India was also very clear that Russia has been a long-standing friend. Through various different crises, Russia has been a long-standing and an all-weather ally. So we cannot simply ditch the side of Russia, given the fact that it also made sense strategically that majority of our armed equipments, the forces, the equipments that they use, almost all of them, significant amount of them have a Russian origin. It is only now, that is in the past couple of decades, that India has started to diversify its sources of defense imports from France, from US, etc. But earlier, most of the defense equipments used to come from Russia. So, in a given scenario where Indian armed forces still operate many of those defense equipments, the utility or operationality of those equipments requires the spare parts, require periodic maintenance, and that cannot happen without Russian help. So that is where Indo-Russian relationship has always been kept at the forefront. Now this is being seen by the world as being partial towards Russia. So there is that issue or the problem that whatever stance that India takes, it will always be seen as a kind of a biased stance with Russia. So what India needs to do is to take a stand much more clearly that this war needs to end. And regardless of the fact that it can antagonize Russia for the short term, but again, the interests are what drives the relations forward. So the interests, the economic interest, the military interest, the strategic interest with Russia, they converge to such an extent that it will have the momentum to carry the relationship forward. Now here, it is also important for countries and India to make that very clear that what both of these nations, that is Russia and Ukraine, both of them, what is their conditionality? Given the fact that immediately when you had the visit of Prime Minister in Russia and Ukraine, at that point of time the war was escalated. Ukraine actually invaded regions of Russia. Now Russia has basically made its stance very clear that it wants Ukraine to vacate its territory and also give a binding agreement that it will not be joining NATO forces. Whereas Ukraine wants Russian forces to withdraw from its entire territory. So there is a middle ground, and that middle ground needs to be exploited, and that middle ground needs to be highlighted by countries like India. So that is where India's role comes to the picture, and the coming month where you have the Prime Minister's visit to the UN, that is seen as a landmark moment. Having said that, India has earlier taken a stance where it has even sometimes boycotted the peace summits. The Swiss peace summit, for example, did not participate in that because it would be seen as allying with the Western forces. So India has gone an extra mile to ensure that it is not seen to be partisan, it is not seen to be biased to any particular member state. But if the resolution needs to come forward and if India needs to be seen as one of those brokering the peace deals, at that point of time, India needs to make its stance clear, both with its Russian partner as well as the Ukrainian counterparts, that this is the requirement for Ukraine to vacate and ensure that it does not join the NATO alliance, and for Russia to withdraw its troops as well. Now, this is where a leaf could be taken out with regards to the 1950s, when India was a very active member in brokering a deal between, again, at that point of time, Soviet Union and the region of the Austrian area. Now, there also you had similar fears, but India successfully managed to broker a deal where Khrushchev's army was something which withdrew. Okay? Now, that is the aspect of what are the issues, what is India's stance, what are the roadblocks, what is the outcome that India needs to seek, and why it is important before the UN meeting, General Assembly meeting, as well as before the BRICS summit in October in Russia. Okay? Now coming to the third article of the day. Third article talks about sharpening India's anti-tuberculosis fight. Now, tuberculosis, it is a prevalent problem. It is an infectious disease having a significant amount of burden and a shared load in our country. India is one of those countries having almost 27% of the global tuberculosis cases. Now, this tuberculosis ends up causing significant amount of loss of labor, loss of lives, and many of the families and population are pushed into perpetual poverty. So that is why tuberculosis is a problem that needs to be tackled. Now, tuberculosis, the problem with tuberculosis is that it is difficult to screen. Many of the times, people carry latent infections, that their body is infected, but then the symptoms do not show immediately. And during that period of time, they can end up spreading the disease by the sprays, the cough, etc. So there can be air-to-air transmission as well. Due to which, what we have as a scenario is an individual who is infected might not know that that individual is infected, might end up spreading the disease to a larger population, and like that, lakhs of population in our country suffer from this TB every day, every year, and many of them are in they are in the unknown about what the impact will be. So first of all, we shall be analyzing briefly about this TB. But then the problem is that now you have the prevalence of drug resistant TB. What is that drug resistant TB? Drug resistant TB is when you gain that infection, but the microbes, they are resistant to the common drugs which are administered during TB. For example, ionacid and rifampicin. Now, these drugs which are commonly administered during the time of the TB, now the microbes, they become resistant to that. That can be because of multiple different issues. Maybe it can happen because you are administered a dose to take care of TB, but then you don't take that dosage only. You get rid or you are unable to follow that regime. Many of the time it happens with all of us, isn't it? For example, we are suffering from illness. The doctor gives you that you have to take these 10 tablets. After 4 tablets, you start feeling better, and the remaining 6 tablets you don't take. Now, that always ends up meaning, or many of the times it ends up meaning, that the microbes, they stay in your system. And over a period of time, they develop that resistance immune system response to those particular drugs which are administered. So then, those same tablets will not work in your case. You need to be administered with a higher range of antibiotics or next generation of antibiotics. So this drug resistant TB is having a strong presence in India. Now, that is largely ascribable to the very long courses that the medicines are administered for 18 to 24 months with 13 to 14 tablets to be taken every day. Now, this is very draining mentally and physically, and people don't follow that. That is where the drug resistant TB develops and they become the sources of infection. So, this article argues that basically the newer methodology which has been brought forward by WHO for the drug resistant TB, what is known as BPALM. Now, this involves fewer number of pills or tablets to be consumed for a shorter time duration. So, that should be adopted in India. The government has made its intentions clear that it will follow this particular regime, and this will ensure better compliance and better monitoring also. But before we take a look into that, first of all, let us understand the issue of tuberculosis. So, when we talk about the issues of tuberculosis patients in the world, you will observe that India has an overwhelming population of TB burden across the world. And then, if you consider the regions of South Asia and Asia in general, TB cases are quite significant. Now, the problem is that many of them, they end up being asymptomatic in the initial days and they spread the infection. And that is where you will have not only lakhs of casualties every year, but at the same time, the infection rate will also increase. That has led to the development of drug resistant TB. What is this drug resistant TB? So, basically, here, why and when can drug resistant TB end up spreading? So, these are the various causes or the various factors which leads to the development of drug resistant tuberculosis. First of all, people do not complete a full course of the TB treatment. As I told you that the present day applicability of the TB treatment is such that you have to consume tablets or medicines for almost a duration of 18 to 24 months and multiple tablets a day. So, not only is it economically draining, many people end up losing their livelihoods, employment, and also significant amount of poverty is incident upon a large section of population. So they end up leaving that treatment in between. As soon as they start getting better or show signs of improvement, there also they leave that treatment. So that leads to the microbe staying in the body and developing that response against those antibiotics. Inadequate or poorly administered treatment, you do not have the adequate mixture of medicines which has to be provided, lack of proper follow-up, lack of proper supply of medicines. This is also something which impacts the developing nations. So it impacts countries like India as well. Then HIV positive patients with active TB end up developing, because in HIV, what do you have? The immune system is completely washed down, right? So the microbes end up having a primacy. Now, in HIV positive patients, whatever amount of microbes that you have, now they need to be finished off by these drugs completely. Otherwise, if you rely on the body's own immune mechanism to get rid of slightest of infection, the body won't be able to do so. So that is where oftentimes you have to administer higher generation of antibiotics to the HIV positive patients who are suffering from TB. Then areas of the world where drug resistant TB is common. So it is a common infection. It is something which spreads easily. Microbes, they develop that kind of a tendency of resistance. So let's suppose an individual is suffering from that drug resistant TB. He or she intermingles in the wider population. So they will spread that particular microbe which is drug resistant to the larger population. The larger population might not have been impacted by TB ever before, but then slowly and steadily that drug resistant cases will start to dominate. Then history of close contact with drug resistant TB case. So each of these cases, they end up being the factors for the spread of drug resistant TB. This is relevant for your examination because UPSC tends to ask you a question associated with these in the mains. Now, here let us go beyond this article a bit. Even these parts, when we talk about the drug resistant TB, the load of case TB. Now, this is something not particularly mentioned in the article, but relevant for your examination. The article largely talks about that the new WHO regime talks about lesser number of drugs, 6 to 8 pills or tablets a day for almost a duration of 8 months. So it is largely to be followed and something can be followed. But UPSC is not going to ask you that particular question. UPSC is going to ask you what is the reality of TB cases in India. UPSC is going to ask you what are the factors which lead to drug resistant TB, what are the various issues that the larger population faces and what is the way forward. So when we talk about the issues, why is it that India has got a large TB case load and why drug resistant TBs are also becoming very particularly prominent and prevalent is the fact that there is a lack of diagnosis and screening that is not carried significantly and efficiently. For example, you still have, as I told you, many people amongst us who basically suffer from this, amongst us as in the larger population who live in larger communities. They suffer from TB, they are not aware of it and they don't go for that screening as well. In many of the cases, it has been found out that only chest X-rays are able to detect those TB infections in latent population where the other simple tests fail to do so. So that is where the diagnosis is also very time taking, and if the screening is also inefficient, means you have lakhs of population who still go undetected. So that is one problem. Then the long drug regime. So if you have to take 15 tablets every day for the next 2 years, that is a regime which is very, very difficult to follow. So it is mentally, economically, physically taxing and economically taxing. Okay. So that is where people don't follow that regime. People opt out of that regime. They feel that they will get better, their immune system will take care of it. But what happens? Leads to the development of drug resistant TB. Development of drug resistant TB cases. Okay? Then many people with the fear that they will lose employment, because TB is still not something which is taken a view as a normal disease. TB has still got a lot of skepticism in the society at large. So a person who is suffering from TB, if that person does not make it clear or public, that person is still accepted in the society. But the moment those people make it public that I am suffering from TB, they suffer a kind of a social ostracization, due to which in many of the low income groups, there is also a fear that this ostracization might lead to the loss of employment, loss of jobs. So they don't declare it, and they go many months and in certain cases many years for without any kind of tests, any kind of medical opinion, etc. As a consequence, the disease grows inside them and they become chief spreaders. Then it is also difficult to track, and the monitoring system needs to be absolutely impeccable to detect any kind of TB case which emerge. Each and every TB, for example, what we followed during the time of the COVID pandemic. At the time of COVID pandemic, it was the first time when the world had to face that, and India significantly managed to tackle some phases of COVID successfully. Now, thereby, what did we do? Each and every case of COVID was given a significant amount of priority. That why is this TB case or why is this COVID case happening, from where is it spreading, that region, test the other people in that area, go for isolation, etc. You had periodic visits by the healthcare officials, and highest accordance or highest priority was given to the COVID cases. A similar kind of standard operating procedure needs to be followed for the TB cases as well. It is a given fact that you have healthcare workers, ASHA workers, Anganwadis, all of them, they do have their visits to these TB patients and they do provide them with the medicines as well. But at the same time, we have to admit that lapse in execution where that follow-up is not always very efficient. There are gaps which end up prevailing. There are certain cases which end up slipping through the cracks. So that needs to be stopped. When you have an air-to-air transmission, the emergency is quite significant. Now, so if these are the issues, and we have highlighted these issues now significantly, that why these TB cases are prevalent, why these TB cases end up developing into drug-resistant TB, and what are the various different issues at the ground level. Now, let us take a look at what is the way forward. What can be done in order to get rid of the issue, because solution is important. First is enhanced screening, as simple as that. More number of people need to be screened, community wise, region wise, cluster wise, habitation wise, settlement wise, region wise. There needs to be a proper screening drive which needs to be carried out throughout the country, and thereby contact tracing, etc. can also be carried out. Monitoring needs to be done with a proper data analytics mechanism. It need not be haphazard anymore. When technology and data and IT services have been driving India's growth, it is high time that we leverage that technology in order to get rid of this problem that we have. Reduction of delays in diagnosis. So oftentimes after screening also, before getting diagnosed, there is a lot of latency period. So that latency period needs to be reduced immediately after diagnosis, and for this the primary healthcare centers which are available present at the Gram Sabha level, at the Panchayat level, they need to be made more aware, they need to be equipped, and they need to be given a particular system of monitoring so that they can monitor the number of cases in their region and monitor the development and the provision of the dosage of medicines in that region as well. Data analytics needs to be leveraged, GIS mapping. Then you have comorbid population, for example, when you have population suffering from HIV. Now, TB testing should be done because chances of them developing drug resistant TB is high. when you have the population who is malnourished. We know that in our country, you have a significant large number of population who, particularly children, who suffer from stunting, wasting and other forms of malnutrition. Now, they also are more likely to suffer from these particular diseases than those living in such clusters which doesn't have proper cleanliness standards, such slum areas. There needs to be a particularly greater amount of attention provided. So, like that, you need to focus on such areas and then ensure that a thorough screening is done. GIS mapping will ensure that you have an exact monitoring system of where these TB cases are in greater amount, so that you can triangulate upon how to remove the TB cases from that region based upon the source identification. So, these technologies can be of help, and also leveraging advanced technology when it comes to even the detection of it. So, portable X-ray machines should be utilized. AI driven detection systems have come into place and should be developed to more accurately detect these cases, or even the asymptomatic cases of TB which end up being latent in the system for a long period of time. Then rapid molecular test rather than the slow diagnostic screening test which is being followed. So, these particular mechanisms can be of significant help. So, these are something which, if implemented at the ground level, can have the potential to change the existing scenario and reduce the TB burden of India, which is very much important. While we talk about the creation of jobs and India becoming the next superpower and India has to utilize the demographic dividend, you have to understand that this dividend can never be utilized unless and until the human capital is at its level best. And human capital means potential of the human resource. Potential of that human resource will always be hindered if they are not fit physically, mentally and economically. And TB is one of the biggest laggards of our times. Okay? So, now we know what is the situation of TB in India. Why is it that drug resistant TB is much more prominent? What are the issues on the ground and what is it to be done going ahead? Let us take a look at the practice question. Discuss the issue of prevalent drug resistant TB in India and measures to make India TB free. Now, this is a 10-marker question. So, here in the intro, what do you write? In the intro, you provide the background for TB cases in India. In the intro, you talk about that the fact that India still has around lakhs of population who suffer from TB and many more who suffer the casualties on an annual basis. India alone accounts for 1/4 of the total TB cases across the globe. That will be your brief introduction. Then after that, when you start writing the body, then talk about the drug resistant TB. So, what is that drug resistant TB? Where the microbes, they basically gain a kind of a resistance to the administered drugs or the administered medicines. So, that is something that you have to write about. Then the factors which are responsible for spread of drug resistant TB, mention those 4 to 5 points in simple point wise manner, and then the measures. Here issues are not asked, only the measures are asked. So, if the question would be that why is it the case that drug resistant TB is more particularly prevalent, or what is the impact on society, then you have to highlight the issues. Here that is not asked. So, simply go for way forward, and in the conclusion talk about the fact that how these drug or how we need to take care of this particular situation or emergency at hand with utmost priority in order to ensure that the population of our country is productive and India becomes disease free. Okay? Now, moving on to the next article, and that is an article associated with the carbon market, article associated with environment ecology. Now, in this year's budget, there had been an announcement with regards to the fact that iron and steel industries and such particular industries which are very energy intensive, they emit a lot of carbon emissions. Now, these particular industries also need to explore ways in order to go for less carbon emissions or to go for carbon neutrality in the coming years. Given the fact that India has set it for itself a target of achieving that neutrality by the year 2070, these particular industries need to ensure that they are not emitting. we have to also understand that under India's own goals and the goals that it has basically committed as per the consequences of the Paris Agreement. Now, India has basically targeted that overall carbon intensity in the GDP would be reduced by around less than 45%. So, that means these sectors such as iron, steel, aluminium, they have to ensure that they are reducing less. Now, you see, when we talk about emissions from the industries, there have been carbon market mechanisms which have been developed ever since the Kyoto Protocol of 1997 to reduce the amount of emission carried out by the industries. So, this carbon market means what? What is the basics of the carbon market? First of all, we will understand the very basic of it. What do we mean by carbon market? So, the basic principle around it is that the aim is to reduce the carbon emission. Okay? Aim is to reduce carbon emission. Carbon emissions. That is the overall aim. Now, how do you do that? You incentivize the various organizations, companies, etc. to emit less. If they will emit less, then as a consequence, you provide them credits. Those credits can be tradable in the market. So, in a way, you are incentivizing those particular industries which can end up emitting less. So, that is the overall system or the mechanism under which it operates. Now, you see, in 2012, India had basically brought about National Mission for Enhanced Energy Efficiency. Energy efficiency, where it sought to bring forward the aspect of solar power being implemented on a large scale, green buildings, etc. Now, under this, India had brought forward a scheme of perform, achieve and trade for the carbon market and for the industries. What was this perform, achieve and trade? So, let us understand that. So, this perform, achieve or trade is for the industries to incentivize the industries to reduce their overall emission levels. So, what is this perform, achieve, trade? So, first of all, as per the Bureau of Energy Efficiency, it is a regulatory instrument to reduce specific energy consumption in energy intensive industries, energy intensive who consume lot of energy, who emit lot of greenhouse gases, with an associated market based mechanism to enhance the cost effectiveness through certification of excess energy saving which can be traded. So, while this definition might be a bit confusing, as is the case with most of the definitions, very simple crux of it that it is to incentivize the industries to emit less so that they will be given credits and that credit can be traded in the market. Now, here the concept was what? Let's suppose you have an industry A and let's suppose you have an industry B. Okay. Let's suppose industry A and industry B. Both of them end up producing, let's suppose, the amount of steel. Okay. Now, if both of them are producing steel, B produces 10 tons of steel, A produces 100 tons of steel. Now, a comparative emission has to be done. So, if B for this 10 tons of steel manufacturing, let's suppose B emits 5 units of carbon, any units, gigatons, etc., 5 units of CO2 equivalent, right? And here A emits, ideally, if for 10 tons B is emitting 5 units of CO2 equivalent, so A should be emitting how much? 50 tons, 10 times, right? But let's suppose A is efficient and A is emitting only 45 tons of CO2 equivalent. That means what? A is having an efficiency system or an efficient system of production. So, A will be provided with credits. For the reduced amount of emission, A will be provided with credits, and these credits can then be traded by A and gain some amount of monetary incentive. It can be traded in the carbon market. So, this is the crux of perform, achieve, trade. Now, India has been transitioning to cap and trade or the emission trading. What is that cap and trade? So, this cap and trade started doing the rounds and started being very prominent after the Kyoto Protocol and the market mechanisms introduced by the Kyoto Protocol. So, what is this cap and trade? So, basically again, let us suppose an industry A, let us suppose an industry B. Now, in the case of perform, achieve, trade, you will observe that there is no such mandatory limit that A should not emit more than 40 tons or B should not emit more than 4 tons, no mandatory upper cap. But then how efficient you are, based upon that you will be given credit. That was perform, achieve reduced emission and then trade with the credits. Now, what is this cap and trade? Now, regardless of how much they are producing, there will be different kind of emission targets which will be given. Let's suppose this is the emission target that they are given. Now, in this case of emission targets, if B ends up emitting only this much, whereas A ends up emitting or breaching that emission target, so A has to be penalized. So, here how does that penalty work or the penalty system work? So, let us suppose B has overachieved. It was the target, it has emitted only this much, right. So, it has overachieved by, let us suppose, 10 units of CO2 equivalent Whereas, let us suppose A has exceeded its target by 5 units. So, what needs to be done is that, or what A can do, A basically can buy these credits from B. So, B has overachieved by 10 units, it has not emitted these 10 units. So, B will get these 10 credit points. Now, A, what it can do, it can pay some amount of money to B and buy the 5 credit points that it requires, so that it will end up meeting the target. That is the cap and trade. This ensures that the various organizations, they are basically encouraged to produce or emit less regardless of whatever the total quantum of product that they are manufacturing. This has got a sector wise target, the country wise target, which has also been done. Now, development of carbon market in India is something which has been picking up. It is almost a decade late since the development of the carbon markets, let us suppose in Europe, etc. But under Kyoto Protocol basically, for those of us who are not very well aware of the Kyoto Protocol. So, in the case of the Kyoto Protocol was basically a result of United Nations Framework Convention to Climate Change. Okay. So, as per that convention largely sets a goal, a larger goal or an objective to be met. Protocols, they end up deciding the parameters or the targets which will help you achieve that goal. So, Kyoto Protocol, which was arrived in 1997. Now, this Kyoto Protocol introduced for the first time across the globe the market mechanisms. Now, market mechanisms basically meant that you can encourage and incentivize the countries and industries to produce less or to emit less, and thereby ensure that that emission, how do you incentivize them? By allowing them to trade, buy and sell. So, under the market mechanism, it basically had various aspects: joint implementation or JI, clean development mechanism, Clean Development Mechanism or CDM, and then a simple aspect of cap and trade. Now, this clean development mechanism is something which is important for us. Why? Because under this provision of clean development mechanism, countries like India, for example, we come under the less developed countries, developing countries. So, we do not have those emission targets given to us, as is the case or as has been the case with the developed nations. So, what India did, India allowed this clean development mechanism or started following this clean development mechanism. What is that? That basically means, let us suppose a developed country like Germany, which has got an emission reduction target to it. Now, a country like India, which is also emitting significant amount of carbon dioxide and other various greenhouse gases, but India does not have a target. Now, Germany has got a target. Let us suppose it is emitting more than its target. That is, let us suppose by 10 units. Now, it needs those 10 credits. Where it can get those 10 credits? So, what Germany can do? It can invest in India. In what? In clean or green infra. Let us suppose Germany helps in setting up of a solar power plant in India, or Germany helps in setting up of a new iron and steel technology industry, which will reduce the overall emissions. So, let us suppose Germany introduces a solar power plant or a wind power plant, whereby the overall emissions will reduce in India. So, in that way, let us suppose the overall emissions to be reduced in India, the infrastructure reduces emissions by 20 units, okay, by a solar plant. If there would have been a thermal plant in its place, it would have emitted 20 units, but now you have installed solar power plant, it will not emit those 20 units. So, there has been a saving of 20 units of CO2 equivalent. So, for this, Germany will get credit in the form of what? Emission reduction units, or ERUs. So, this is something that India started implementing and India started developing. India started being a participant to that. By 2011, by 2013, India had become the largest generator of ERUs across the world after China, which indicates what? That India had been receiving significant amount of investment in cleaner energy. So, this has been the journey through the carbon trade and the carbon market for India. Now, given the fact that Indian economy is also maturing, India is transitioning to a fast-paced economic development and an economic growth, where almost for the past 2.5 decades, our growth has been around 5 to 8%, ranging around that time or that period. India is stressing upon the development of infrastructure, and for development of infrastructure, you need iron, steel, aluminium, these sectors to produce more. Now, these sectors are emitting a lot of carbon dioxide. So, not only do we need to make this carbon market much more attractive and lucrative for these industries, so as to ensure that these industries, they get incentivized to reduce their emissions, they get incentivized to modernize their method of production, so that the overall emission levels are reduced. So, that is where, for example, what can be done? Provide certain tax breaks, that if you are able to earn these many credits, or if you are overachieving, you will get this much tax breaks, or provide them some other incentive, make some infrastructure availability free for them, make the availability or certain regulations associated with expansion, etc., which is more lucrative to them, which is something that the industry needs. Make the availability of working funds or capital or the loan requirement easier if you are emitting less. So, if these kind of parameters are put into place, then these industries, which are going to be the main pole of India's growth story for the next 3 to 4 decades, these industries will also be incentivized to adopt a cleaner and greener mechanism. Okay? So, that is what this article talks about. So, in this article, what have we discussed? What is that concept, or which are the industries which are energy intensive? That is iron, steel, aluminium, fertilizer, cement, etc. Now, the requirement of these industries in India's growth story. Now, what was the concept of carbon market introduced during the time of the Kyoto Protocol of 1997? India brought forward National Mission for Enhanced Energy Efficiency, under which you had the National Solar Mission, you had the Green Building Plan. There itself you had the PAT plan, that is the Perform, Achieve, Trade. What is the concept of Perform, Achieve, Trade? Where companies or industries are incentivized to emit less, and how that incentive is given. Then after that, we have taken a look of basically why that Perform, Achieve, Trade has then transitioned into a cap and trade. What is that mechanism of cap and trade? How does it work? What is the mechanism of CDM, Clean Development Mechanism? What is the concept of ERU, which is provided as a consequence of CDM, and India being a recipient or of these investment and generating lot of ERUs, and what can be done going ahead forward in order to ensure lesser emissions. Okay? So, this is something which is very, very important for your examination, given the fact that climate change and emissions are always going to be the fulcrum of current affairs. So, here, what is PAT in the context of carbon market? And discuss India's approach to carbon markets and the issues faced. So, here in the intro, what do you write? Intro, you talk about that Perform, Achieve and Trade, which has been basically launched as a part of National Mission for Enhanced Energy Efficiency in 2012, incentivizes the industries to reduce their level of emissions by providing them with credits. That's it. You don't have to go into the explanation with the help of example, that is for your understanding. After you have written that, then start the body with the aspect of the second question, that is discuss India's approach to the carbon markets. So, they talk about the fact that India had started implementing the aspect of Perform, Achieve, Trade, then India started implementing the carbon market mechanism of Clean Development Mechanism brought forward by the Kyoto Protocol to UNFCCC, whereby it attracted investment and became the largest generator of ERUs across the world after China. Having said that, now this is something that you will give in the background. Then after that, draw a schematic just to show a difference in presentation skill. Draw a schematic representing that aspect of ERU. This particular schematic you can draw. That will highlight to the evaluator that you know about the details of CDM. You have not simply muggified it from any particular book. That is very important. After that, you talk about the fact that despite this, we need to fulfill our overall agenda or the promise as per the Panchamrit Declaration, whereby India has committed to reduce the energy intense industries or the contribution of energy intensity in GDP to around 45%. So, talk about the importance of reducing the emission in the portion of iron, steel, cement manufacturing, etc. Then in the conclusion, talk about the fact, or here you also have to highlight the issues. The issues faced here are lack of monitoring, not proper maturing of the carbon market in India, not enough avenues for that. After that, talk about that this needs to be sorted out or this needs to be developed much more efficiently if we need to gain carbon neutrality and ensure that emissions from India are reduced in the long run. Like that, you can conclude the answer. Okay? Now, let us take a look at few of the articles relevant for your prelims, starting with basically India, Russia sign a working plan to handle emergencies. Emergencies here refer to basically the natural disasters and tackling of natural disasters. So, they have signed a kind of a working plan. Now, this follows the intergovernmental agreement between Russia and India, which has been signed a long time back. This is a follow up or the implementation of it in order to deal with the natural disasters. So, as per this has got three various different important phases or steps. What are those? First is the use of space technology, that is satellite monitoring, in order to monitor the various different aspects of disasters. So, use of space tech. Then after that, you basically have to train the professionals as well. So, training of people who deal with the disaster management, disaster relief and rescue, and then sharing of best practices. So, these are the 3 steps of the stages involved as per the part of the intergovernmental agreement between India and Russia to tackle the natural disasters and the impact created by these natural disasters. Now, this has been lent an executionary arm as a result of this pact which has been signed. Now, further transmission of Chandipura virus possible in the coming week, says WHO. So, Chandipura virus infection and outbreak in India has been quite significant. And that is where it has raised a lot of alarms in various different areas with regards to how to deal and how to tackle with this particular virus. So, first of all, for your prelims, what is important is, what is this Chandipura virus? So, this Chandipura virus is basically a member of the vesiculovirus genes of the family, that is Rhabdoviridae. It is the same family from where you have the rabies virus. That is important for your prelims. First isolated in 1965 from the region of Maharashtra around Nagpur, and from the region where it was actually detected, that is where the name Chandipura has been derived from. It has also been derived from or isolated from Madhya Pradesh, and the basic common occurrences, it leads to encephalitis, that is swelling of the brain tissues. So, this Chandipura virus is vector borne, that is it needs a carrier, particularly sand flies. Okay. They are the carriers. Now, these sand flies are very common in the household systems across, right, with the likely vector believed to be the female sandfly insects that are prevalent in the early monsoon period. Now, under laboratory conditions, even Aedes aegypti, which is a transmitter or a vector of dengue. Now, even Aedes aegypti has actually been seen to be able to transmit that under lab conditions. In reality, we still have not traced that, but it might be possible that in the present circumstance, when dengue outbreak is quite common in India, that Aedes aegypti might also be at work. Okay. So, here what is that Chandipura virus? Which are the vectors which spread that? Then what are the impact or what is the symptom caused? So, it causes encephalitis, that is it leads to the inflammation or swelling of the brain tissues. It largely impacts young ones below the age of 15 years. Does not mean it cannot impact the elder population, but this is the most prevalent population which is impacted. Typical manifestation: rapid onset of fever, vomiting, altered sensorium, that is you start hallucinating, then convulsions, diarrhea, neurological deficit, then meningital irritation also. So, these basically are the common symptoms which are very, very common. Now, there is not an antiviral drug which can be administered. The key to it is early detection and isolation, so that you can basically treat these individual symptoms. You do not have an over encompassing drug which is available for this. Okay? Now, then environment ignored in considering sites for Nicobar Islands project, says Jairam Ramesh. Now, there has been an to and fro of the letters between Bhupender Yadav, the Minister for Environment, Forest and Climate Change, and Jairam Ramesh, who was the ex-Minister of Environment, Forest and Climate Change in the previous regime or the previous government. This is with regards to the Great Nicobar project. Now, Great Nicobar project being developed in the Great Nicobar Islands. Now, this project is something relevant for your examination. Now, this project talks about the development of various different sensitive infrastructure in the region of Great Nicobar. Now, the government has always cited it as a kind of a key infrastructure project for a strategic purpose, because Great Nicobar lies at the very fulcrum or lies at the apex of those transportation routes through the Malacca Strait, where you have the Chinese military oftentimes making incursions into the region of Bay of Bengal, and that is where, in order to monitor that, India wants to bolster up its defense at this frontier, at this forefront. So, that is where you have, as per the requirements or as per the provisions of the Great Nicobar project, it talks about the development of a power plant, talks about the development of an international airport which will be used by the Air Force as well, talks about the township and area development for the people in that region, and talks about the international container shipping, right, a transshipment harbor which can also provide economic benefit. So, the government is saying that it is strategically very sensitive and important project. But the argument has always been, which has been given for almost 2 years now, which has not only delayed but has cast aspersions on the project, is the fact that the environmental clearance which has been provided is not up to the mark, and various different areas have been, or various different parameters have been ignored. For example, the argument or one of the leading accusations has been that when it comes to the Nicobarese and the Shompen tribe who live in that region, now their land has been or will be acquired. Now, while the government argues that we will end up setting up the medical centers and separate rehabilitation areas and the tribals won't be impacted, but then the activists argue that these tribal regions, tribal regulated areas should not be tampered at all. And also the aspect that this Galathea Bay, you have the Galathea National Park as well, this Galathea Bay, which is very vital for certain aspects of or certain types of birds, leatherback turtle, horseshoe crabs. So, it basically houses very critical aspect of biodiversity. Great Nicobar Islands is a part of biodiversity hotspot. Biodiversity hotspot, and it is a part of the Sunda land biodiversity hotspot, which tells you that quite significant amount of critically endangered species and threatened species are present in the region. India has got 3 other biodiversity hotspots. Which are those? Let us see. Put that in the comment section below. But having said that, this brings to attention, or for us, for the prelims, what is important? Where is that Galathea Bay? Where is that Galathea National Park and the Campbell National Park? Now, out of this, Galathea National Park basically has got some of the important animals, crab eating macaques, right? Macaques generally, they are the arboreal species, they live amongst the trees. So, you do not get crab eating macaques, then giant leatherback turtles, shrews, all of these pythons, crocodiles, and in birds the megapod, particularly the Nicobarese megapod, that is also to be found in large quantums in the region of Galathea Bay. So, that is why it is relevant. You need to know where it is situated. Okay? Now, then the last article, that is CCEA, that is Cabinet Committee of Economic Affairs, clears 12 industrial parks across 10 different states. Now, these industrial parks, which will be developed in different states, in different regions of the country, they follow a part of what was made as a budgetary declaration, where basically you will have these plug-in industrial parks, where let us suppose you want to establish any particular setup, or you want to establish a manufacturing setup or anything. There will be a large park which will be allocated, a large area which will be allocated. Now, this will have all the available infrastructure, from connectivity to the aspect of provision of electricity to the aspect of all the logistical requirements. Everything will be provided in these industrial parks. Now, this will be developed in the number of around 100 across the country, so that there can be industrialization which is not centric towards the metropolitan areas, but overall industrialization which will be partnered by the union, the central government, the state government, as well as the private players. So that is the aspect of the industrial park. Okay. That brings us to the end of the discussion for today. I hope that this discussion has been helpful, has added to your existing knowledge set. I hope you have liked the discussion. If you have liked it, if you have liked this initiative of ours, please do not forget to click on the like, share and the subscribe button. Till we meet again, take care of yourself. Goodbye. Thank you.